Right on. Thanks all. While Sean's getting the presentation fired up here, I'll remind you to put some questions in the chat. We're going to have some time after this presentation for a little Q&A and discussion. But yeah, Sean and I have been running around the West. We really appreciate working with the Wyoming partners. There's a lot of opportunities, a lot of things happening way beyond the Lander area. And so we're speaking to kind of that Wyoming partnership today. And the virtual format has given us the opportunity to invite a lot of folks. And so we encourage you to look through that list of partners that are there and really build this community. So I'm going to go on mute here, and Sean, you can get us kicked off.
Sounds great. Good morning, everyone. Glad to have you all here. We're excited to do this presentation for you, and it's a great start here. Really what we're going to talk now about is reading the landscape. Let me see here. This guy right here is one of the main characters we're going to talk about this morning. Bill Zeedyke. Bill started in New Mexico with these techniques for slowing water down, storing water in the soil, and he brought these techniques up to Colorado, which this picture was taken. This is an SGI Sage Grouse Initiative workshop that we had a few years back in Gunnison. And what Bill urges us to do is really observe the landscape and see what we can find out, and then think like water. One of the things that I wanted to bring up from the beginning is these features on the landscape, these gullies. These are relatively recent occurrences. You know, you can imagine that the people building this cabin didn't really want to walk out their door and fall into a gully, and so we can think about these gullies and some of these events on the landscape as being fairly recent. Reading the landscape, in Bill's view, he takes into account all three of these different disciplines. And this is what we call Bill's trilogy, how to read the landscape. And we look at hydrology, we look at geomorphology, and we look at ecology in a particular system. We're going to start first with hydrology. The local hydrology, something when you want to go to a site and try and investigate what's going on, these are some of the first things that you need to start looking at to try and understand what's the system doing, how can you work with it, but when does the precipitation arrive? Is it a spring-fed system? You know, it oozes out all the time. Do you only get your moisture after our snow melt, you know, in the spring? Here in Colorado, we're getting a little bit of monsoon flow finally here, but sometimes afternoon thunder showers can be a big driver in your system. So when does the precip arrive? Similarly, you know, how long do you have that water? Is it perennial water? We've talked a little bit, Mark talked a little bit about different wetland types. Is it an intermittent? Is it ephemeral system? So when do you get that water and how often does it run? Also thinking about duration and magnitude. You know, what's a normal storm intensity and duration? How quickly does it run off? Is it channelized? Does it run off really quickly in your system? Does it have sheet flow? These are ideas we're going to talk about. I like this slide from courtesy of Bill from New Mexico. This is Canyon Bonito. Here's average. This is what we used to have. Or, well, every year we kind of get this amount of precip. We're entering this more variable stage now, where sometimes we have severe drought, and the next month we have increased flooding intensity. Big floods come through. So it's this sort of feast or famine type scenario, which seems to be our new normal. One of the things about reading the landscape, you want to try and identify natural hydrology. Look at the landform in this picture. You see this creek coming across the side hill like that. Is this a natural creek? So learning to pay attention to clues in landforms, you know, may inform you that this is actually an irrigation ditch. It's being taken out of the main channel, which is over here where these willows are. And so reading the landscape, being able to identify that this isn't a natural occurrence, maybe this isn't something to restore, this is just an irrigation ditch. So paying attention to landform can really give you clues about your hydrology. And so in reading the landscape, the next discipline, Jeremy is going to talk a little bit about this. This is geomorphology. And these ideas become really important when you're reading the landscape. And I'm going to pass this to Jeremy.
Perfect. Thanks, Sean. Yeah, you know, my rancher friend in Idaho, Jay Wild, likes to say you're either a ologist or you're an And by that, he's talking about you're a land manager, a rancher, or some form of an ologist, biologist, ecologist. Well, I like to hang out with and ologists when I'm learning how to read the landscape, because from each of these disciplines, each of these expertise and perspectives, you're learning how to pick up on different things. And so one of the latest ones I've been thinking about here is geomorphology and hanging out with geomorphologists. And this will be a really key component to reading the riparian landscape. And so one of the things I want to quickly introduce you to is just this, the basic components of a valley bottom. And by the valley bottom, we mean that green area and that top figure that's really your floodplain and your active channels if you have them. Then we're going to probably hear about like alluvial fans, which are those tributary drainages that dump in and intersect your main stem. And then finally, like terraces are abandoned or historic floodplains, those upper surfaces that were wet at one time, but no longer part of that active floodplain area. And so we're showing two examples here, one intact, one in size, to show you how those things can fluctuate, and really important for understanding what's possible. So next. I'll boil this down to the most simple component. What you need to learn how to recognize is where is the valley bottom. And typically, if you're walking up and down a drainage, it's like that really flat surface, right? It's the one that's been laid down over millennia by soil being deposited as it moves through this system. And sometimes vegetation can be very misleading. You can't just look at what's green now. You can see flatter surfaces beyond the green that were actually wet once, but no longer are wet due to some kind of dewatering event. And so understanding where that margin is in your valley is really critical, because that valley bottom equals your maximum potential riparian or meadow vegetation. Next. And the primary resource impairment that we're going to spend the bulk of the day talking about here is the channel incision problem. This is widespread in systems across the globe. And essentially what we're referring to is that channels form in these valley bottom systems, and over time, through disturbances or events, can actually cut down through that what we call alluvial or floodplain material and dewater a meadow. And as that water table drops, green groceries go away. So those wet meadow and mesic meadow resources that you're used to seeing can dry up and turn to sagebrush and dryland grasses, upland grasses, as that water table moves lower. And so this will be a concept we're going to talk a lot about throughout this course. Next. And geomorphologists have been describing the evolutionary pathways of channels over the last 30, 40 years. And so if you're in the stream world, you probably have heard of Shum's channel evolution model. More recently, there's been this advancement in thought about the stream evolution model, which adds in some new dimensions here. And it kind of brings back this idea that before there was ever a stage one system with a single, kind of that, quintessential single threaded sinuous channel, we had a lot of systems that were just a mess. They didn't have a single channel through them. Water was going everywhere. It was sheet flowing. And geomorphologists refer to that as stage zero, or these anastomosing systems. And so we've really forgotten what's possible because it's been a couple hundred years since these things have started to incise. And so we're going to help you reimagine the potential and maybe get more of those stage zero conditions out there on the landscape. All right, next slide. I think we're turning it back over to you, Sean.
You bet. Thanks, Jeremy. So thinking about geomorphology a little bit, we've already talked about head cuts and gullies. These are two really important concepts that everybody needs to understand, what a head cut is, this change in elevation in a meadow here like this. It's basically formed by a waterfall coming over and creating a plunge pool. This is the leading edge of gully erosion. And so you can see here, we have another head cut. This is looking downstream. We have a head cut here. This is the leading edge of this gully. This gully is advancing as this head cut falls off, caves in. Now all of this over here is disconnected floodplain. This used to be a big wide meadow. Now it's got a head cut and a gully. The water table has dropped away. And as Jeremy said, this is the channel incision problem. We start to lose our water table, lose our green groceries. We're losing these wet meadow areas as a result of these two formations. This is a concept that it'll be on a quiz later for sure. But how does a head cut advance? Everybody needs to understand this. How does this head cut work its way up the valley? And basically what happens is soil is washed away from these roots, all these roots here from the plants that are holding the soil. They die back, and then the soil is washed away, and rinse and repeat. Every event, the water pours over, erodes more of that soil away, the roots die again, the plants die, and it just keeps on moving up valley. So that's how head cuts advance. We talked a little bit about this stage zero concept. So most wet meadows or mountain swale systems really shouldn't have a channel. Water's historically flowed across this whole surface as sheet flow. And we have sheet flow versus concentrated flow. Excuse me. Here's sheet flow up here. It's all spread out, moves slower, has time to infiltrate, minimal erosive force. But when water falls into this head cut and we have concentrated flow in the gully, all of a sudden it gets really fast, more erosive, and the adjacent meadows on each side dry out. This is the channel incision problem. Here's a landscape in Wyoming. This is Deep Creek around Lander. We have a nice big broad valley up here, meadow with no channel. All of a sudden down in here somewhere there's a head cut, and all this sheet flow flows in then, and it gets into this channel. It starts going really fast. You can see we're already starting to get different vegetation in here. Here's that same head cut, big broad stage zero valley. Now we have a channel. Water rushes off the landscape really quickly. We're starting to get sagebrush already moving into these places. We're losing our wet meadow as a result of this sheet flow moving to concentrated flow and dropping our water table. Another signature of early channel development, you can see we have a big hole here, nice intact floodplain. Here's another hole. When those two connect, all of a sudden we have a channel. All of this will dry out and we'll lose this meadow. Reading the landscape, it's also good to think about old roads. Old roads and trails are definitely factors on the landscape. Here's the new road. We just move it over. Here's the old road. This old road traps all the flow coming off this hillside, puts it into a channelized area, scours the bed. This over time will become a gully. So old roads and trails, look for that. As we were going up the valley bottom with our horses and wagons back in the day, and now today with our trucks, we drive right up the valley bottom. This is the easy spot to drive. We don't drive up here on the side hill with all these rocks. You drove right up the valley bottom. Well, all these ruts, they collect water over time. They de-water this area, concentrate the flow. We lose our wet meadows. Similar example, reading the landscape tells you that this is actually an old road up on the side hill here. You can see the true valley bottoms down here. This tells you that this isn't a natural creek. Same example, different location. Here's the trail. Here's the true valley bottom. All the water coming off this hill drops into this, de-waters this area here. So understanding that and being able to read the landscape can tell you what might be possible in these particular situations. Here's the new road. We're looking up valley. Here's the old road. Now it's a gully. All of this meadow used to be watered before all the water got trapped in this old road. Now all this is de-watered. Being able to read the landscape and recognize that this should be a wet meadow, this shouldn't be all sagebrush, can tell you where is the restoration potential in this particular system. Still on geomorphology, what are the soils telling you? So we went from landform, now we're looking at soils. For example, we have these oxidized rhizospheres in here. A lot of you wetland people out there can identify that this landform right here used to be a lot wetter at some time. Right now it looks pretty dry. You can see a bunch of lissum or something dry up in here. Got a gully. All of the water table is gone from this system. But this tells you, this signature tells you that this used to be a lot wetter. So what are the soils telling you? What types of soils are there? Is it really fine-grained soils? Are we running gravel? What kind of particle movement do you have? Is there sediment? What's the sediment source? These are all things that you should investigate when you're reading the landscape in a particular reach and trying to figure out what might be possible. So fine-grained silts being trapped by this piece of sagebrush that fell in the creek, really fine. Sandy stuff, look how fast this particular head cut is moving. This is a signature of really fast erosion here, sandy soils. So sand and gravel, all of these types of sediment can inform what's your restoration potential in a particular reach. So we've gone through the two of the ologies. The last ology we're going to talk about today in reading the landscape is ecology. And this really has to do with species diversity interactions, animals. You know, are you working in a grazed pasture? It's an important consideration. A grazed pasture by livestock, or do you have, you know, quite a bit of elk use in your area? Is there evidence of trailing to and from a water source? Past beaver use? Sometimes all these things, if you see past beaver use, sometimes that can inform what type of restoration potential a particular area might have. And also vegetation. Vegetation is one of the key storytellers that we use to tell us where's the water and how much is it. A lot of you folks know about wetland indicator status of plants. You know, we know everything about which plants occur in wetlands and which don't. So you can look up that stuff for particular species in your area. But they grow in specific spots. You know, we have some uplands, a sagebrush, little wetter then. We have some upland grasses here. Maybe we move into some rush, some Baltic rush or something like that. And then finally, in the really wet areas, we get sedges and willows. So knowing what type of vegetation in your particular area and how much water each of those plants represents can tell you a lot about reading the landscape and telling you where is the moisture. Be observant of this signature where sagebrush is moving into a wet meadow. All these new little sagebrush plants in a former wet meadow, that's an indicator that things might be drying out. So be observant of those changes on the landscape. Remnant willow stands around springs, or old willows that have died and are gone now. These are really old willows that have died here. This can tell you where the water used to be, and maybe that can inform some site potential that may be existing in this area. Reading the landscape and paying attention to vegetation changes. This is a swale. We're looking downstream. We got some juncus in here, pretty wet, some potentilla. All of a sudden the vegetation changes, and all of a sudden we're into sagebrush and we've got a juniper down here. Probably a head cut down here. The water table's dropped out of this particular system. The vegetation is telling you something's going on with the water table at the bottom of this drainage. There's a bit of a tricky one. We have all this dead sagebrush out in this meadow now. I can tell you that sagebrush doesn't like to have its feet wet for very long. And we applied a treatment up here to this meadow, reapplied sheet flow, surface flow over this meadow, and we've been killing this sagebrush now. So paying attention to the vegetation changes over time can tell you a lot. Similar to roads, ungulate training, whether it be cows, elk, wild horses, they like to trail straight up and down the valley bottom too. And this does the same thing as roads. Water jumps in those trails, erodes over time, channelizes and straightens water. Water that moves fast and straight has a lot more erosive power. So look for this signature on the landscape. It can tell you a lot about what might have happened in the past. Same thing here. We have a nice big meadow up here, green sedges. All of a sudden, the water gets trapped in this trail, and all of this adjacent area right here is drying up because it no longer has access to the sheet flow because it's fallen into this elk trail. Down off the mountain it goes. We're losing our wet meadows in so many areas across the West as a result of this channel formation. But reading the landscape, trying to understand that this is not the natural condition. This is silver sagebrush moving in on a former wet meadow due to the fact that all the water is running down this cattle trail right here. So reading the landscape and being able to understand this can inform the opportunities for restoration that might exist. All of the soil is still here. The vegetation is still here to be transformed back into a mesic or wet meadow. We just have to understand how to put the water back to work. So that's reading the landscape using Bill's trilogy. All of these three things work together, and that's how we try to approach a particular reach and find out what are the impairments, what should this look like, and what can we do about it. Very good.
Great, thanks, Sean. And at this point, we are going to move into a moderated kind of Q&A session. So if the presenters from this morning can turn on your cameras, Mandy, Mark, Sean, and Brian. Would like to start off with just answering some questions. I know the synapses are just getting firing for you, so feel free to enter those in the chat and we'll entertain them throughout the day here.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Well, we may have to cut this a little short given timelines, but we'll start off with a few questions we have received. I guess the first one is, what is the impact of conifers on wet meadows and riparian areas? Why and where would conifer removal be implemented or not implemented? All right. In some places, aren't conifers stabilizing the banks and preventing further erosion?
Yeah, all great questions. I can take a shot and others can weigh in here as well. But yeah, I mentioned this as part of kind of the watershed perspective on influences to hydrology. And so, we've had a tremendous amount of conifer encroachment across the Intermountain West. And by that, I mean like species like juniper, in some areas it's Doug fir, and others have moved out of historic forested lands down into our rangelands that were really dominated by like sagebrush grasses and wildflowers. And that's caused a ton of chain reactions in the hydrology. And so there's a lot of research on this related to everything from changing how the snow falls on the landscape, right? So if you have tree encroached rangelands, snow actually disperses and evaporates and transpires quicker than and doesn't build those drifts that you're so used to seeing in sagebrush country, where the wind really accumulates those. And those drifts are really important to late season flow in streams. And so there's everything from that to the shifts in vegetation. As you get that really dense juniper overstory, you lose your grasses and shrubs that provide kind of deep root pores for water to infiltrate and not just flood off in the spring. And so there's all kinds of complex relationships. But if you just think about starting in the valley bottom, and even that just sub-basin right around your little meadow, the vegetation in the uplands can influence that.
Jeremy, I would like to just add to that. There's been a recent publication by the Forest Service, the Rocky Mountain Research Station, that came out here maybe a couple, 3 months ago, just basically nailing down what you just said. They looked at some of the hydrology loss due to sublimation of snow due to tree encroachment, and they estimated, with the trees encroached the way they are, we're losing 25 to 30% of the normal hydrology that would be coming down as runoff.
Yeah, very good. If there's no further discussion there, we'll move to the next question. After restoration of an animal trail in a wet meadow, what type of management will be needed to keep this from happening again?
Yeah, I could take a crack at that. Next up, that's kind of a nice leading question really for what we're up to next, which is going to be some of our toolboxes. And there'll be a technique in here that we call a drift fence that we can talk about. But a drift fence is designed to stop or eliminate trailing up and down the valley bottom. And so I think it's a great question in that you can put that water back, but going back to the lead cause is always a good idea. And so maybe after we go through that presentation, if there's some further questions on that particular topic, we can review.
Yeah, very good. And there was a question by Dennis, and I think we'll hold that one till after module 3 as well. I think it fits in better there, but we will get to it. What about the idea that head cuts are just natural? Won't they eventually stop migrating on their own?
Yeah, Sean and I have discussed this a lot. We've can think of specific landscapes where you see watershed wide head cutting, right? Almost every drainage you walk into, there's head cuts, and you start to wonder like what's going on. Clearly, there's some base level controls when it comes to hydrology, and like your main stem rivers and streams, if they drop and lower in elevation, everything upstream is going to adjust to reach that angle of repose that's needed to function. And so yeah, there are historic and system-wide changes that have occurred, but that doesn't mean that you need to let those human modifications typically are what cause those, or over longer periods of time, clearly climate and stuff. But it's not necessary to let those run all the way to the top of the watershed and take eons to evolve through that evolution process. So what we're looking for is opportunities to stop that process from working its way all the way up. Sean, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really. That was great. I think, over time, if head cuts aren't super active, they will lay themselves back a little bit and heal up on their own, but only if, they don't have consistent water flowing over them. So yeah, there's not a lot of controls naturally to stop a head cut.
That rinse and repeat slide is one to burn in your brain, because that process right there of those roots dangling, that's really the key thing we're trying to address, is keeping herbaceous plants, right? So someone asked about juniper and conifers, aren't they holding soil? If you look at trees, most of their biomass is above ground. They have big roots underground, but not deep, fibrous, very dense roots like herbaceous plants. Wetland plants in particular have an incredible network of fibrous roots. And so they are the ones who really hold wet soils together. And when they dry out, soil just dissolves and goes away, which is why you can't stop a head cut unless you hit a rock or a tree, or you just have no more flow.
Yeah, very good. I always like to think of kind of the natural range of variability when you're talking about that. Certainly erosion's a natural process, but have we done something to accelerate that, figuring out what we can do from there? So I think Sean hit this one already, but are all head cuts formed by overland flow? What's the impact of subsurface flow?
Yeah, definitely. Subsurface flow can have an effect, especially when that whole sponge is wet and water is oozing out of a particular head cut. It doesn't necessarily have to have overland flow to keep eroding, because that water is still coming out subsurface out of that sponge. And so, but I would say the majority of it, majority of the activity is from surface flow flowing over the top and washing that soil away from the roots, but that can happen at a subsurface level as well.
Okay, I think we got time for one last question. And I'm not sure I fully understand it, but I think that the question is basically, how do you account for flood irrigation practices in coordination with wet meadow restoration? I think basically, how do you account for that basically unnatural overland flow, and can the flood irrigator use the water to bring the water table back? Can it be, basically, can it assist in restoration? I think is kind of the question.
Yeah, Mark, you want to weigh in on that? It sounds like you've got some ideas and things already happening with working meadows, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is the answer, but as we know, like we'll use the Bear River for an example in Wyoming, where it's a highly incised channel, and flood irrigation actually kind of has replaced a lot of that natural flood onto the floodplain into those old relic oxbows. And so in that case, agriculture is actually, and flood irrigation has taken the place of what would naturally occur. But from a restoration standpoint, and in kind of not the Cokeville Bear River example, it's just, yeah, trying to get that when we're dealing with flood irrigation is a lot of times, flood irrigation adjacent to some of these systems actually sometimes exacerbate erosion too, because it can be the system is flowing water, and it's flowing water over the lip into those drainages. That supersaturation can also lend itself to exacerbating the erosion occurring. So I think trying to find the balance of where we can use flood irrigation in a way that it promotes wet meadow, I think is great. In these other areas that it actually causes a degradation, let's figure out a way where we can actually minimize those impacts to increasing those erosional kind of situations.
And if you understand the principles of what we're talking about today, this will be a lot less scary and uncertain. And really that idea of sheet flowing water, you know, when Bill Zedike says think like water, that's what I think about, is like, how's the water running across the vegetation, hopefully on your surface, right? Is it rushing off? Is it shallowly spread out and slow and going into the ground like Sean was talking about? And so if you're working in a flood irrigation dominated system, you know, you want to be thinking about that and having enough vegetation, a roughness on the surface, so that it doesn't cause erosion, but it actually enhances the wetland plants that are there.
Yeah, thanks. I would just add one last thing, I guess, to that discussion. And the key point maybe is at the end of what you're irrigating, the end of the meadow, where it re-enters the channel or the gully. That's the spot where you can really start to get that erosion that Mark was talking about. So after you've irrigated your field or your meadow, as it falls back down into the channel, that's the spot where you need to, we call it a stable return site. That's the spot where you need to be careful that you're not causing head cuts at that elevation that will work back into your irrigated area.
Yeah, thank you all. And Lydia, if I didn't capture your question correctly, I guess please work with Hannah and maybe we'll try to get it clarified and addressed later. But I guess with that, I think I've already taken 2 minutes away from your break. The schedule is to reconvene at 11:10. It gives you about 13 minutes to use the restroom, rehydrate, hit the liquor store, whatever you need to do to get you through lunch. And I guess during that time, I'd like you all to be thinking about ways that you can incorporate anastomosis into your daily vernacular. We'll see you at 11:10.